Good morning, everybody. My name's Fiona Reynolds and I'm the chair of the Green Alliance, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this really important event. I mean, the first thing to say is just how overwhelmed we are by the number of people who are joining us this morning. We've had over 1,000 registrations, and I can see by the number of participants that we're clocking up really fast towards that number. And I think that's really indicative of the enormous interest in the subject that we're going to be discussing today. In fact, it seems to me that this is a moment that is very timely, that is very important, and I think is rapidly becoming mission critical to us all. And so it feels like the response that it's generated is very much of its moment and something that needs to happen, a discussion that needs to happen. So we're really grateful to Ravina for chairing and to our speakers, who I know are going to bring great wisdom and insight this morning. I suppose the only message that I want to give at the beginning is just to say something slightly personal, which is about the fact that this movement can change. I realized with a bit of a shock actually yesterday that it's 40 years ago this week that I started working in the environmental movement. That seems a very long time ago. At the time, there were literally no women in senior positions. The movement was very, very different. In that time, things have changed. Things need to change more. But I think as a movement, we can be confident that we can move forward, and in doing so, do so in ways that respect the society and the world around us. So I'd like to hand over to Ravina, who's going to chair the event today, and just renew my warm welcome to you all. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted and honoured to be joined by our three expert speakers. So firstly, we've got Mya-Rose Craig, who's passionate about conservation and is the president of Black to Nature, an organisation that fights for equal access to nature. And secondly, we've got Cherise Johnson, who's a policy advisor at the British Academy and has worked on a huge range of environmental and social issues. And finally, we have Safina Ahmed, the director of the John Ellerman Foundation and previous chair of the expert panel on equality, diversity and inclusion at the Institute of Fundraising. So before we get cracking with our discussion, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. So if you've got any questions for our panelists, if you could please put them in the Q&A function as opposed to the chat box, that'll be really helpful for my colleague Gwen Buck to just sort of collate them as we're going along and put those to our panelists later on. And also if you could click the thumbs up button beneath a question that you really like, just so we can prioritise your favourite questions a bit better. And if you'd like to tweet about the event at home, if you could please use the hashtag #GAEvent. Great, so let's kick off our discussion. So first, I'm going to come to Mya-Rose. So Mya-Rose, as someone who's got such a strong connection to nature, I wonder if you could tell us about a really special experience you've had with nature, but also when it was you realised that we've got a serious problem around access to nature.
Oh, yeah, I mean, firstly, thank you so much for asking me to speak today. I think it's amazing that this event is even happening. I've been doing diversity campaigning in the nature sector for nearly 5 years ago now. And when I say that, like, when I started, this kind of event never would have happened, like, I'm not exaggerating at all. And I think, like, I feel very privileged because I grew up in a very rural area and I've always had a really, really strong connection to nature. My parents are bird watchers and they've always taken me out into green spaces. So I think it's always been a really integral part of my life. And yeah, I have like countless amazing experiences with nature really that I could bring up today. But for me, it was when I was a child and sort of that sudden realization that like, I suppose having that relationship with nature made my life better, and I didn't want that to go. Like I always wanted to have that with me. But yeah, I think like I'm half Bangladeshi, and although I was in like a little family unit, it was my mum who's also Bangladeshi and my older sister and I who were all going out together along with my dad. And it always felt, you know, really comforting, I suppose. But as I got older, I sort of slowly started to realise that I just never really saw anyone that looked like me. And I think that almost wasn't a light bulb moment, like it was just that slow, really unpleasant realization. And I was really young at the time. I was about 11 or 12 when it suddenly like all came together for me. And at the time, I didn't have any understanding of the issue at all. It just felt like a real tragedy that other kids from similar backgrounds to me weren't getting the same opportunities to me, because I felt so privileged having been surrounded by nature all my life, and I wanted other kids to have that opportunity. So basically, I started running nature camps. I set up my organization Black to Nature, and I go out of my way to encourage VME or visual minority ethnic kids from inner city areas to come out into the countryside and give them that opportunity to engage with nature. And to answer your earlier question, that is probably my favorite moment of connection with nature, because I think it just brings a completely new perspective when you're taking people out into a space that's so alien to them, and they just find everything so exciting, even the things that I have sort of just accepted and become really mundane. But I also do a lot of campaigning within the nature sector, and yeah, like I said, I've been doing that for about 5 years now. And although it has been quite painful for a lot of it, it feels very much like you're sort of shouting into the void and no one's really listening. I don't know, I feel optimistic, I suppose. And I think even the fact that, again, events like this are happening shows that people are finally prepared to listen and to try and create change. And I guess I can only hope that that will continue in the future, because I really genuinely believe that we need all our different communities involved in order to make this environmental movement sustainable, and in order to make sure that people really, care about saving the planet, care about saving our biodiversity, because
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mya-Rose. That was really, really interesting to hear. And like, it's really interesting as well to hear how you've kind of reflected on your journey to where we are now. And I wonder if what is kind of your hope and your vision at a time when we're trying to be optimistic, and perhaps this is a moment where we no longer feel like we're talking into the void. Everybody is listening, everybody is watching, and everybody wants to change. Kind of, what is it you hope for the future? And yeah, how do you see Black to Nature?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think there's a lot of potential ways it could go at the moment, and my biggest hope is that, because there is still such a lack of understanding of the issue in the sector, because it's almost a cyclical thing where there's not enough VME people, so no one understands the issue and it continues. I'm hoping that with events like this, where people are really listening to what we have to say and listening to what we want, and therefore figuring out what these communities actually want from them rather than just guessing, it means that they open up enough of a path forward that they can start to progress things and start to evolve in the way that they just haven't been able to in decades past. But yeah, at the end of the day, it requires a genuine desire for change from the sector and from these organisations, and it's just not going to happen otherwise. Diversity isn't just going to fall into your lap. You need to work for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mya-Rose. So Charisse, I'm going to come to you now. So as a policy advisor who's worked on overlapping issues of science, social justice and environmental justice, I wonder if you could talk about the way that NGOs have often worked quite separately on issues of environmental versus social justice, and importantly, why does that need to change now?
Absolutely. First, I have to say to everybody who's watching, I checked out what organizations many of you are from and noticed that some of you might be my future employers. So I'm glad to see you here, truly. I'm obviously here because I want to make sure you work on making it a better and more welcoming place for myself and for others who look like me to work when the time comes, so we can make positive change and thrive together. But in all seriousness, in my experience, the social justice aspect has either been an add-on, a quick afterthought, or it's just eschewed altogether in environmental organizations. But the reality is that social justice is at the core of environmentalism. Inequalities don't exist in a vacuum. That's a universal truth. There are cumulative impacts, there are feedback loops, but the fragmented way that NGOs have worked on things, working on specific issues without considering full context, these things haven't necessarily always been considered. But the problems do exist, and they don't just exist, over there, like in the US and the global South, they exist here as well. So a couple of examples, the town of Corby, where the burden of proof was put on the community to prove that toxic particles from a land reclamation project on a former British steel site had been inhaled or otherwise ingested by mothers and unwittingly poisoned their unborn children. To prove that the toxins were airborne and could travel miles through the air to be inhaled by these mothers. Another example, Ella Roberta, the little girl from Lewisham in London who died some years back from air pollution, whose mother fights relentlessly for justice still. Those are just a couple of examples, but there's so many more, and not always to do just with air pollution. There's a great need to share and collaborate more across and between sectors, to apply a systems-based approach to solutions, but that's easier said than done. We need to create a space where that can happen in a more spontaneous way, create spaces where people have agency and their thoughts are heard and their ideas are supported. So what I want from you all to take away from me in today's conversation is this: there's so many things that I wish I could tell you. There's so many conversations I want to have with all of you, but some things I just want you to take away today are, you have to be able to hold several seeming truths at the same time doing this kind of work. And quite often you'll need to sit in the discomfort. Truth like representation our entire race, and representation is not enough, nor is it the goal. And we need to find solutions quickly so people will stop needlessly bearing the brunt of burden due to the color of their skin. And you also can't rush this work, so hurry up and start. Then a few more things: you need to get input from your staff, and you need to be sure not to be extractive or rely on the emotional labor of marginalized people. You need to collect data and understand we're more than data points. Then there's, lastly, the paradox of tolerance. You need to be tolerant, but you shouldn't tolerate the intolerable. And with that said, I just want to emphasize that I'm speaking, yes, as an individual who works at the British Academy, so I might share some of the things we do there, but my opinions are not necessarily representative of the British Academy, and I draw primarily on my experiences before I moved to the UK.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cherise. And I'm just going to leave what you said there because that is absolutely powerful. And I think, yeah, we need to take a moment to really take in what you said. Thank you so much. Safina, good morning. So as director of the John Ellerman Foundation, which often funds projects in the social action and environment sector, and someone who's been advocating for equality in the charity sector for a long time now, what do you think environmental NGOs and organisations more broadly need to do first to start tackling racism and issues of diversity and inclusion?
Thank you. Really happy to be here, and I'm so pleased that Green Alliance are hosting this discussion. I'm going to try and make sure with my answer I don't kind of touch on things that have already been covered, but I will say off the top that this is quite a difficult question to answer. For me, there isn't one first thing that organisations must do to tackle issues of racism and of diversity and inclusion. Instead, I think that there are a whole host of things that organisations need to do first. And I know I don't have a lot of time, so I've broken it down into 3 buckets. And that's, the first is to commit, the second is to coordinate your efforts, and the third is to get comfortable. So committing to this work is so essential. It needs to happen at all levels of an organisation, but especially at a board and senior level. Committing means that you need to embark on honest, difficult and uncharted conversations about the role you have played as individuals and as organisations in helping or hindering progress on equity, diversity and inclusion. And I would really encourage people to have a conversation about power and privilege and the way in which that can result in racist practice and hinder our progress towards equity, diversity and inclusion. Essentially, it's about committing to understanding that not only are we part of the problem, but we are part of the solution too. Secondly, coordinating your efforts. This means having a plan in place that is based on evidence and is a clear analysis of the work you need to do in order to become an anti-racist organisation and an organisation that's committed to equity, diversity and inclusion. For us as a funder, we're putting our plan together, and the analysis that we've done so far is resulting in us reflecting on questions like, are the people that we fund representative of the sectors and communities we serve in the UK and the UK overseas territories? Is our funding accessible, equitable and inclusive, or does it marginalise or disadvantage certain groups and causes over others? Is our approach to investment ethical and environmentally sustainable? And what role should we be playing as a member of the charitable funding sector to address the poor track record that the sector has in distributing its funds equitably, especially for communities of colour? So the plan that you commit to, based on the analysis that you undertake, needs to include baselines that allow you to compare yourself with others in your kind of stakeholder network, and it should allow you to think about the ways in which your current practice can be improved. It needs to have ambitious targets, because I think that's the only way that you can really achieve improvement. And the plan needs to be well coordinated, and it needs to take on board all of the assets you have as an organisation and all of the assets you have access to. I would also really say that in the development and delivery of your plan, please create safe and brave spaces that centre and empower the voices and experiences of staff and stakeholders you work with who may have experienced the disadvantage and the marginalisation that you're trying to now address. And finally, get comfortable. There's so much to do and unpack. It will take time. There are going to be quick wins and slow wins and everything between. There are going to be losses and mistakes along the way. There will be conversations and moments that are comfortable and inspiring, and those that are deeply uncomfortable and difficult. But as long as there is a commitment to move ever forward and to do so with the right intentions, then progress is always possible.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you so much, Safina. And just as a follow-up, and also I'm going to try and open this particular question up to Mya-Rose and Charisse as well, because I'm sure you guys have thoughts on, you know, practical steps we can be taking and actions that organisations can be taking. But Safina, I wanted to ask, have you had experiences of kind of steps that have been taken that have worked but also may not have worked, and kind of do you have any reflections on perhaps where organisations kind of a path they shouldn't be going down, and mistakes that have been made that you've seen?
So I've definitely had experience of working with and in organisations that are seemingly very much committed to equity, diversity and inclusion, but if you don't do the work at the beginning to really centre yourself in this conversation, to understand where your perspectives are coming from, and it speaks to Charisse's point earlier about, you know, I am me, I can't represent a whole body of whatever label you've decided to assign to me on a particular day. So I think organisations that kind of commit to this because they know it's something that they need to tick in a box, without doing that work to really understand how they're grounded in this conversation, the role they play, the you know, the mistakes they've made as well as the contributions they've made, I just feel that the targets become a little bit pointless, or the work becomes a little bit pointless, because you need to understand what your baseline is and what you're building up from. And so I'm not going to kind of say, oh, this organisation did it really well and this one didn't. I would flag that the Institute of Fundraising, the Change Collective work that they did, and I'm obviously biased as a previous chair, but you know, we went into that conversation and we did that kind of thinking and deep analysis work, and I think all of us involved would say that we probably all came into it with our own ideas of what we wanted to happen and intentions behind why we were there, but actually the kind of result of that piece of work was far different from anything we imagined. And it is also about just going with it and going where you're being led, if that makes sense, rather than coming into it with a sense of, I know what to do, this is what's going to happen, it's all a done deal, because then it's just not going to be an authentic or successful endeavor.
Absolutely. And Charisse, I just kind of wanted to open that question up to you as well, in terms of practical steps that you think organisations should be thinking about and should be taking to increase diversity and inclusion.
Well, first of all, everything Safina said, I mean, just round of applause on all of that. I'm with all of that. I think on practical steps, the first thing, obviously the first thing I think of is don't just focus on increased diversity and inclusion, because what you're implicitly saying is you've created a hostile environment that isn't fostering diversity and inclusion. It's bigger than numbers and body count. So what sort of change do you want to see? And then I guess another thing I would say is, just be like Nike and just do it. The research is out there. Consultants exist, entire organizations dedicated to helping you become an anti-racist organization. Not even just one that focuses on diversity and inclusion. They're out there, and they're waiting for you just to reach out and ask for their services. And some of the other things I would say is, obviously, just ask yourself, who makes decisions about policies and procedures? How is that power and information shared? Who's missing from the conversation? How do different decisions impact different workers? And then also I would say, keep the understanding that training is well and good, very necessary, important, but as we all know, deficit of information doesn't always translate to behavior change. So before you go into that, definitely have kind of like a risk analysis kind of to guide you, and because it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be hard. I don't have examples of organizations who are doing it great, but I do have a lot of examples of organizations who are trying and making big mistakes and then learning from those mistakes. It's ongoing. So I think that would be a lot of my, actually also one more thing, to be kind of specific to the audience that we have here. I'm thinking with your staff pages, your missions, your value statement, just like water quality surveys of streams, right? So you look at the macroinvertebrates that live in the streams as an indicator of the level of pollution. That's what we do with your staff pages and your mission and your value statements, or lack thereof. We inspect the organizational stream. And as I know from experience, that's even not enough if the internal culture is lacking. So having the right words to draw in the diversity when the organization itself isn't up for the change is a major bait and switch, and that's something to keep in mind.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Charisse. So Mya-Rose, as someone who's a president of a grassroots organisation as you are, I wondered if you could kind of talk about things you've learned as you've kind of grown as an organisation, and the fantastic camps that you set up for young people of colour, and just kind of how you've fostered a really safe and inclusive environment, and kind of made sure that people of colour who perhaps haven't had the fantastic privilege, not that it should be a privilege, but the privilege of enjoying nature and access to nature, and just how you've created that environment, and maybe things you've learned along the way.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I mean, firstly, I do just want to put out there, like a bit of a self-plug, that Black to Nature is actually a consultancy organisation. We have done work in the past helping organisations figure out how to diversify their different projects and stuff. And I think like one of the big things that I had to learn immediately was that things that might be obvious to people from these communities are like absolutely not to people outside of them. And I've actually run 2 conferences called Race, Equality and Nature, all about figuring out in a really systematic way what the barriers are and why there aren't people from these communities engaging with nature. Yeah, and I think your usage of the word privilege just then is really interesting, because I think during lockdown I've been thinking a lot about privilege and how access to green spaces and the countryside and nature in the UK is absolutely a privilege. Like, it's something that you need to have enough money and enough time and enough energy to go out and do, because otherwise it becomes absolutely inaccessible. And a lot of the green spaces in cities just are really degraded. They're not very, like, they're just not very nice, basically. People don't want to spend time in them. And I think obviously it is two separate issues, but it would be like slightly disingenuous not to acknowledge the fact that there's a really strong link between class and race, and the fact that a lot of people aren't going out into green spaces, because there's also a massive issue with working class people just not going out into the countryside. And I think that's also something that needs to be acknowledged. And I think, yeah, in terms of the camps, again, it's been a massive learning curve. And I think the most difficult part of running them is you know, convincing the parents that it's a good thing for their kids to do, that they're going to be safe, they're going to be looked after, it's all going to be really well run in the way that they like. So for example, a lot of Muslim parents are comforted by the fact that we're Muslim, so they know all the food's going to be halal, they know the girls and boys are going to be completely separate in their tents, stuff like that, which, like, a lot of these parents don't even send their kids on school camps, so it is something that's completely alien to them. And I think, you know, it brings up the conversation of why these people from these communities aren't engaged with nature in the first place, like historically, not currently. And personally, I think it ties into class again, where we have this massive issue where people are migrating here and they want to build new lives and they need to support their families, and they're moving into urban spaces when before they've absolutely been rural people. And they have no time for nature. And I think that's been passed down, so that now a lot of people in my generation feel like they are urban people, they do not belong in the countryside. And I think something that could be really important going forward is reclaiming that that historical rural heritage. Yeah, but at the end of the day, the biggest lesson I've learned is just reframing nature and figuring out that even though I consume it in a very certain way, like I'm a bird watcher, I like knowing all the names of stuff and like recording it all and things like that, that doesn't do it for a lot of people. And I think just coming to terms with the fact that in the UK we have a very certain view of what engaging with nature is, and it's much broader than that. You can just go out and sit in the park and watch the squirrels run around, and that is engaging with nature because it's green space and it's wildlife. And I think, you know, getting your binoculars and going birding just doesn't do it for a lot of people. And by finding different ways for people to connect, it makes a massive difference, and they really can just engage like that.
Brilliant, thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And something else I wanted to touch on, and Safina, you kind of already touched on the role of boards and kind of senior leadership. So I kind of wanted to ask all of you, how can leadership teams within the sector, including boards as well, be held accountable on this issue? So not just kind of saying the right things at the moment and kind of showing the good intentions, but obviously this is going to be a long journey, and this is not something that we need to start and stop today. This is going to be a long journey. So how do we continue to make sure that our senior leadership teams and board are accountable? And Safina, is it all right if I come to you first?
Yeah, could go on for hours on this. Targets and commitment to those targets is probably the simplest and shortest way I could respond. I really believe that if boards and leadership teams are not committed to this agenda, then if you've got people at lower levels who, let's face it, tend to be of a kind of broader background in terms of people of colour are more likely to be at lower levels of organisations, unfortunately, then, you know, they alone can't make their experience of an organisation better. And the stakeholders you work with are also kind of a step removed from your organisation. And if they're kind of experiencing the disadvantage or marginalisation that might be occurring because of the practices you engage in, then, you know, unless your board and your senior leadership team are visibly committed to this work, then it is impossible to feel that an organisation will progress, in my opinion. It's not to say that they're the only part of the solution, they are just one element of it. I think having targets is really important, as I mentioned. I also think that a board and a leadership team that is comfortable in engaging in a public discourse on these types of topics is really important. It kind of speaks to points already made that, you know, if this is important to you, then that should be clear when we look at your websites, when we talk to you in meetings, and when we go to your events. If it's not coming across clearly, then there is an issue. You're not saying what you think you might be saying. And so it needs to be something that just kind of is an aspect of all that you do across all of your activities. But I do think that senior teams and boards are so essential in driving that forward. And I do think that targets and visibly talking about it and reporting on what you're doing is really important.
Absolutely. Charisse, have you got anything else to add on top of what Safina said?
So definitely agree with everything she said, but something else that I was thinking is, you know, what does it even mean to be kept accountable when you have all the power, right? We say that a lot, but it seems to be almost empty. So your job is to fill it and give it meaning. Create your own accountability. Let your employees tell you what they need from you. And again, be explicit about your support for racial justice. Examine your own biases, your own complicity. Work on yourself first. Critically acknowledge how you might be perpetuating inequity in your organizations, on your teams. Examine the systemic racism in your own organization, in company policies and procedures. And another important thing would definitely be creating measurable outcomes with timelines. And even if you have the capacity to do so, creating leadership programs to combat the glass ceiling racism, that would be an excellent step. Otherwise, one way you'll notice that you're doing something wrong is when you've got a mass exodus of your POC staff.
Absolutely, great. Thank you, Charisse. And Mya-Rose, I wanted to come to you on a slightly different question. And I know this is going to be quite a challenging question, so there's no right or wrong answer at all. But just kind of thinking about, do we need a complete systems change? Is there kind of a fundamental problem with how the environment sector has been operating that has led us to this point? Or do you think it's kind of some kind of smaller but kind of across the scale changes that need to happen? What are your thoughts on your experience so far?
That is a really interesting question, and to an extent I think one that maybe isn't important, in that there probably isn't going to be a complete upheaval and reshuffle of the sector, and we are stuck in a situation where we have to work with what we have, I suppose. And which is why we're here talking about all these things. And I think one thing that would make a massive difference is people really sitting down and thinking about their own prejudices, because everyone has them. And I think partially because of the type of people that end up working in the nature sector, where it's very liberal and very middle class, people don't want to think that they have prejudices, and they don't want to think that they could possibly be racist because they're not, I don't know, committing hate crimes. And I think, you know, even again, in like the short period that I've been doing stuff, I've experienced a lot of like microaggressions and racism. I think people really do just need to sit down and have a think about why they're interacting with a VME person in this way, or why they're coming from this direction and things like that. And I think also, yes, for various historical reasons, we've ended up with a very small section of society within the nature sector. And I guess just thinking about like why we have these sort of traditional ways in, like, so for example, many people have to do years worth of free volunteering to get a job because it's so oversubscribed, and most people just cannot afford to do that. They don't have the time, they don't have the money, and they will just go off and do another job. And I think, and people then go like, oh, I don't know why we don't have people from like lower socioeconomic backgrounds coming into the job, and it's like that's why. And I think, you know, just I suppose really self-examining and like, I suppose thinking past what's already going on, thinking about the whys of it all does make a massive difference. And I think also something that historically has been quite a large issue is kind of what we were talking about earlier, like this pushing of diversity aside. Like, so I know a lot of organizations that have their diversity officer, which doesn't work for a variety of reasons, but partially because a lot of the time these diversity officers are just, I suppose, the same as everyone else in the organizations, but also because diversity doesn't work if you just have one person working behind the scenes to try and get more people involved. Diversity works best if it's a core value of your organization. Again, it's something you really desire, something you really want. But I think if it was possible to have like system change, I suppose, I think the main thing really would just be I suppose a slice of every single different section of society really coming together harmoniously to figure out how to save the environment and how to, I suppose, save the world. And I guess it's that vision that we're working towards at the moment.
Great. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end this discussion section. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Gwen Buck, who's got some fantastic questions for our panelists from the audience. Thanks, Gwen.
Thanks, Ravina. Yes, thanks so much to everyone who submitted questions in advance and who's also submitted them into the Q&A box. We've had some fantastic questions. They're sort of broadly categorised into, how we got here, to requesting practical steps we can all take to address racism in the environment sector. So in terms of just setting the scene, we've had this question submitted in advance. This is from Joanne Sherwood from RSPB Northern Ireland, the director there. What is the biggest barrier to racial equality in the environment sector? I don't know who would like to start that first. Perhaps Charisse?
Sure. I mean, I'd say there's definitely several, but as Mya-Rose just mentioned, with jobs, even with getting people into jobs, you have to have all of the volunteer work and everything. I was just thinking about my own personal experience and how I came into it and how incredibly frustrating that was, and how much debt I ended up having to go in to get a master's degree, because that's the kind of thing that everybody was looking for. But I stuck with it. But not everyone can do that. So that is a huge barrier. A huge barrier is just even getting your foot in the door. For sure.
Great, thank you. Safina, do you want to come in?
Just very briefly, I think it's actually a problem that's happening in the charity sector more widely, and the barrier is that people don't believe it's a problem. And I think that there is definitely progress that's happening at a faster pace than it has been for the kind of 10 years that I've formally worked in the sector. But I think that's a barrier. I think people feel that we're doing good and therefore we are good, and that definitely applies to a lot of what we do, but this problem does exist, and acknowledging it is a way in which we can start to really have some progress.
Great. Gwen, over to you again.
Thanks. Another question submitted in advance was from Sarah Mukherjee, who's the CEO of the Institute of Environmental Management Association. And it's a bit of an interesting question, because I think it will all, you'll have quite different answers to it, but it's who is ultimately responsible for the lack of diversity in the sector?
Mya-Rose, do you want to have a go? I know it's a big question, but you can take it in any direction that you think.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I think, like, I feel like I'm saying the same things over and over, but I feel like part of this issue is sort of because the environmental sector or environmental NGOs have been around for ages in the UK. Like, we have a really long history of caring about the environment, particularly if you're middle class or you're upper class and you have like extra money to spend on those sorts of things. And I think we've got a lot of that stuff still hanging over us, and it means that we have the same sort of people getting involved. But I think also it's not fair to entirely blame it on history either. There's a lot of things happening right now, like we were talking about jobs, But also, I think in a lot of our communities, there's sort of a lack of understanding or appreciation of the nature sector and the charity sector in general as well. So like, I know, for example, of quite a few kids my age that were interested in going into nature or doing like a degree that was related, like zoology, and because their parents didn't have that understanding, and because they, you know, they want the best for their children and they want them to go and do jobs where they're going to go and make loads of money and be really successful and maybe become very middle class, and because there isn't that understanding, they won't let their kids go and do jobs like that. And I think that speaks of the massive disconnect between you know, the environmental movement and the environmental sector in general and our communities, that, you know, speaks of the wider issue, I suppose. And like, so like, I know it's quite surprising for us, but a lot of people in my Bangladeshi family, for example, don't know anything about lack of biodiversity, don't know anything at all about climate change, don't have any knowledge at all about any of these issues. And I think, you know, there's a really, really big communications issue going on that's just not really being acknowledged.
Great, thanks, Mya-Rose. Charisse, who do you feel is ultimately responsible here?
Yeah, I would say, well, again, I agree with everything Mya-Rose said, but in my experience, as you know, an American anyway, I would say the historical aspect has so much to do with it, especially with racism and the gatekeeping of the environmental sector and it being a very white space. Because, you know, the way I see it, our communities, you know, like Black communities, different Asian communities, whatever the case may be, we have been outside, like we've been in the environment, like there's a rich culture and history of us being a part of the environment and really respecting it and understanding it. What's happened then you have racist structures in place that just keep pushing us back, leaving us out of it by any, you know, whatever the case may be. Either it's you know, you don't get paid anything, you have to come from a wealthy family to begin with to stay in these spaces, because you're not going to get paid much, because you have to take on all these free internships, because you have to, you know, do all this volunteering. I think that's a huge part of it. You know, again, drawing on the US is, you know, one of the things you hear a lot is, you know, for example, why do Black people not swim? Well, why don't we swim? Because when we try to go into the same pools as white people, we would get acid thrown into the water on us, you know, so we start moving away from this. So I cannot say that word right now, generationally, you have people passing on like, no, this is a space that we don't enter because we're not welcome. And that continues. And so we're trying now to break those barriers and change that. And like Mya-Rose mentioned earlier, we're trying to reframe it and reclaim it. Because like I said, we've been here, we've been in these spaces, and we'd like to come back, but we need it to be more equitable. So it's something we can actually try to do.
Great, thank you, Charisse. And Safina, did you want to come in on that question as well?
Just really briefly, I do absolutely agree with what Charisse and Mya-Rose have been talking about, and reclaiming and thinking about it in terms of our history has really kind of struck a chord in a way that I wasn't expecting this morning. But the thing I would say is it is about the systems that we are favouring in terms of our educational systems and our political systems, and the way in which we are all part of that. So we have a role to play in kind of dismantling or reimagining them. But I do feel that we are in a situation whereby, you know, education systems write a certain narrative, which means that if you don't see yourself in it, you don't realise you're part of it. The same is true for political systems. We have one that is very comfortable in othering or labelling different groups based on, you know, characteristics or stereotypes or whatever else it might be. And I know it seems trite or simplistic to say, but if you don't see yourself, then you don't see yourself there, you're not going to achieve it. You're not going to think that that's a space for you. It's as simple as that, as well as all of the very complex things that Charisse and Mya-Rose have kind of articulated far better than I ever could. So
brilliant, thank you, Safina. Gwen, do we have another question?
Yes, we've had quite a few questions about the role that funders play. So I guess this is more towards Safina, but how might environmental NGOs better work with funders and tackle racism?
So I think as funders, we have a lot of work to do on ourselves in terms of improving our own processes and systems to ensure that they are equitable and inclusive, and that we aren't marginalising or committing to racist practice, whether we meant to do so or not. So I think first and foremost, we need to really focus on ourselves and improve the way in which we distribute our grants, as well as reviewing the way in which we might invest, particularly for those of us with endowments. But even those that are fundraising, think about where your money is coming from, and whether or not that's kind of exacerbating the harms that you're trying to then eradicate through your grant making. In terms of how we can work together with environmental NGOs and, work collectively to redress the system and improve it, then it's conversations like these, it's having spaces and places in which we can start to think about how we can improve as a sector. I think it's about accountability. Obviously, as a funder, I have a lot of power and privilege, and you're not really ever going to disagree with me if you think that a check is on its way. But there is work to be done in terms of how do we work with you in a way that is not a power imbalance, but a more balanced way to say, what is it that your organisation needs in order to progress in this area, and how can we as a funder support you, recognising that we're not perfect in this either. So that's kind of some of the ways in which we can help. And within our kind of sector body, we have the Association for Charitable Foundations. They have a diversity, equity and inclusion working group that's doing a lot of work around how we better manage the data and the evidence around this, so that we can improve as a sector as a whole. And there are others that I'll shout out as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, and if I can quickly speak about my personal experiences, like as someone who's running a grassroots organisation, I'd say that I've had a really, really difficult time getting any funding, and in the last year or so, I've had a really difficult time trying to become an official charity in the first place, just because, again, there's this complete lack of understanding of the issue, and I keep on being blocked from that because I keep on being told that VME people aren't going out into the countryside, so there's no need for my organisation, which obviously is the whole purpose of my organisation, but it means that it's really difficult to get funding. And I think that if there was more education in general, and maybe more understanding about these.
Completely unacceptable from a funder. Like, at the end of the day, the people we fund are the experts. We aren't. We are, as at Element, we're generalists but specialists in 3 funding categories, but ultimately the people we partner with are the experts. So for someone to say, or a funder to say that, BME people don't go out into the countryside, well, I mean,
no, it's okay. It's just like, for me, it feels like very purposeful ignorance, I suppose, just because like I said, we've been doing this for 5 years now. We've been really successful. There's like hundreds of kids that want to work with us, and again, I think like there's just a complete lack of understanding around these issues and the purpose of like the kind of change that we're trying to create.
Brilliant. Great. Well, I think we'll stop there with questions from the audience, unless Gwen, you want to squeeze in a last one.
There are so many amazing questions, but I think in order to stick to time, we might have to move on now.
Sure. Great. Just kind of for a final remark, I'm just going to kind of leave you with a question, but this is just also an opportunity to just kind of round up. Could you tell us about an inspiring approach or action, no matter how big or small, that you've seen an environmental organisation take in order to tackle racism or issues of diversity and inclusion? Mya-Rose, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, of course. So something I've been talking about quite a lot over the years is representation in media. And the fact, so for example, there was this project where they were going into schools that were mainly minority ethnic, and all of the pictures where they had like 15 kids in these PowerPoints, like in a single picture, I mean, they were all white, and it was very much like, you know, constantly sending out this message that like, you're not the type of person who engages with nature. But I just remember like a moment for me was when I opened the post and I had like a kids RSPB magazine that was for my niece. And I like opened the package up, and on the front page was just this young Asian girl. And I just like, it just made me tear up a bit, because I read that magazine when I was a kid, and it was just thinking like, if I had been younger and I saw that kind of thing, it would have meant so much to me. And I'm so glad that kids now are seeing themselves reflected back in the media they're consuming.
Brilliant, thank you, Mya-Rose. Charisse, I'm going to come to you next.
Yeah, so the things we've discussed briefly in today's panel barely skim the surface, and you know, you'll all need to delve deeper and sit with the discomfort, like I mentioned, and think creatively and inclusively about solutions. But I'm hesitant to pat anyone on the back just yet. So the fact that we're only just having this conversation right now highlights the fact that we have a great deal to do yet. Understanding that the work isn't about self-congratulation, and the most inspiring work, honestly, that I've seen exist at the margins, you know, in communities. But with that said, I will give a little kudos. I'd like to mention what the National Trust has done recently. They made a statement about their history of slavery and colonialism, which was met with support from some and vitriol from others. And I just wanted to use this as an example to tell everyone, you know, this is something that honestly you have to get used to, because it's going to happen. It's not easy to do. You'll have to tell people, you'll have people telling you, I mean, that they're going to cancel memberships, withdraw support. And my advice to you is just to stay steadfast and continue trying to just keep your eye on the prize, and remember that we're just trying to dismantle racism.
Brilliant, thank you. And Safina, we'll finish with you.
So I wanted to highlight the Environmental Funders Network. Firstly, if you're a philanthropist or philanthropic organisation funding in the environmental sector, and you aren't a member of the network, then I would encourage you to look into changing that. So I want to highlight them for two reasons as to why they've kind of inspired me. The first is the Environmental Funders Network do a newsletter regularly, and they circulated one on the 12th of June this year. And the newsletter is always open with like a short statement from their brilliant director, Florence Miller. And in her opening of that newsletter in June, she talked so decisively and succinctly about Black Lives Matter. And it was just that moment of her, really, for me, it demonstrated real allyship, leadership, and grit, because she was so clear it was an issue and it needed to be addressed. And she gave some really thoughtful readings that we could look at, and it was just a really powerful moment. And, you know, we were kind of in the midst of the lockdown at that point, and we were a bit tired and run down and overwhelmed. I certainly felt that way, and it was just a real bright spot. And the second reason is because at this year's Environmental Funders Network retreat in March, they held a session on power and privilege and philanthropy and beyond. And it was a really brave and safe space in which we as funders could talk about the ways in which our work harms and hinders our commitments to equity, diversity and inclusion and anti-racism. And so for me, the retreat, the newsletter, they're both just great examples of an organisation that is committing to tackling racism and to delivering equity and inclusion.
Brilliant, thank you, Safina. That's really, really useful. So just kind of a final closing from me. Thank you so much for everyone's involvement. And I'd like to say a special thank you to our amazing speakers. And just to say how much I appreciate all three of you coming here today to talk about an issue that I have no doubt has personally affected all of us, and a lot of audience members at home. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that this is no small task and no small thing that you've all done coming here today. So thank you. And to our audience members who perhaps have been kind of lucky enough to not have been personally affected by systemic racism, I say to you, allies are everything. Kind of people of colour in the environment sector cannot do this work alone. We should not be doing this work alone. We absolutely must do this work together. And the sheer number of you who have come along to this event today shows me that that's what we're going to do. We are doing this together. We're starting here. This is absolutely not the end. And it's going to be a long and hard but fantastic journey of making real change. So thank you, everyone. Great, so I'm now going to hand over to Jo for a few closing words before we give a round of applause to our speakers. Thanks, Jo.
Great, thank you, Ravina, and thank you to all of our panelists again for such an insightful and thoughtful conversation. And great that so many people have been able to be part of it and show the appetite for change. I just wanted to say a few words about Green Alliance in this. You know, we're really at the early stages of our work to unpack and address racism in our organisational structures and our policy work. Earlier this year, we've come up with a plan for an active diversity and inclusion programme with some of the practical measures that have been talked about today, and also about how we represent diverse communities in our communications and in events like this. But I think one of the key things is that we also realise that we need to keep on learning and better understanding the experiences of people in different communities, and to not come up with the answers straight away, but to try and find out and learn and listen to different voices. So whilst we're definitely not paragons of best practice yet, we want to get there, and we feel that enabling these conversations and sharing across the sector is critical for us to do that. And as has already been said, sometimes that will be very uncomfortable for a lot of us, but only until it isn't. So let's keep trying and let's keep making progress. So I just wanted to let you know about a few other initiatives, and there's a few been mentioned already by panelists here today, so we'll try and round those up and share them with all the attendees today. But I just wanted to let you know our friends at Wildlife and Countryside Link have been convening a group of environmental NGOs who are looking at a lot of the diversity challenges in the sector, and will be providing useful insights on their work. So keep an eye on their website for updates, and maybe get in touch with Richard at Link if you'd like to be more involved, although you may not appreciate me saying that, given there's still 600 plus people on the webinar today. And in mid-October, IEMA, the Institute for Environmental Management Assessment, will be holding a meeting for environmental chief execs hosted by IEMA's CEO, Sarah Mukherjee, who we had a question from earlier. As a person of colour in the sector, she's going to be suggesting actions that can be taken to increase diversity and inclusion, and inviting guests to comment and sign up to a plan that includes some challenging actions. So let her know if you'd like to participate. We'll circulate her contact details after the event. Here at Green Alliance, we plan to run some follow-up events, so we'd love to hear your feedback on today's session and suggestions for future discussions. But finally, you know, all of us have attended this event because we recognise the importance of addressing racism in the environment sector. The moral case is evident. Making our organisations more inclusive is absolutely the right thing to do. But we also need to make sure that we're able to increase public support for our environmental causes. And in order to do that, we need a better understanding of diverse communities, a better understanding of their connection to the environment, to nature, and to the range of concerns about climate change and of social justice. And of course, a better understanding of the barriers to inclusion. So including more diverse range of voices in all of our work, in our case for the environment, can only strengthen our work going forward. So I'd just like to finish up now by giving another heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists. It's been brilliant today, to Cherise, to Mya-Rose, and good luck on the Greenpeace ship, and to Safina, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing how we progress and support each other over the coming months and years. So please join me in thanking our panelists in a virtual round of applause.